have the best thing that administers government, that protects your rights to property, and what form it is, whether it's monarchic, aristocratic, Republican, or whatever, is not so important. What is important, and for Locke about the only thing that is important, is that that form of government receive the consent of the governed. And of course, people don't necessarily have to consent to democracy. If Locke is democratic in that way, it is only because he's democratic in the sense that government derives its authority from consent. It does not necessarily have to be democratical in form in that respect. But it is this idea of consent, and you will no doubt talk about this in your sections, it is this idea of government as being by consent that has so much insinuated itself, I'm not sure that's the right word, but is so much formed in many ways the cornerstone of the American regime and American political thought. In many ways, even more, I would suggest, than his doctrine of property and property rights. Locke's doctrine of consent is what captured the imagination of the American founders. When Jefferson wrote about the ends of government, he said the ends of government are to protect life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He seems to have modified Locke's statement about life, liberty, and estate. Why did he do that? We could talk about that. And of course, what is meant by the pursuit of happiness certainly is intended to entail, among other things, the acquisition of property. But Jefferson, in some ways, sort of elevates Locke's language, Lockean language. It is not simply focused on property, but the pursuit of happiness in many ways, however construed, consistent with the rights of others. But it is Locke's language of consent, that the just powers of government derive from consent, that seems to have most inspired Jefferson and the founders. And through that doctrine, it, of course, had a huge effect on America's greatest second founder, Abraham Lincoln. Consider the following passage from Lincoln. This is Lincoln in 1854 in his first major speech, first most important speech, sometimes called the Peoria speech, where he was already debating Stephen A. Douglas. It was for the Senate campaign in Illinois, appropriate in our time of the year, where they were then arguing, as they would again for the presidential campaign, argue over slavery. And here is what Lincoln writes. When the white man governs himself, that is self-government. But when he governs himself and also governs another man, that is more than self-government. That is despotism, Lincoln says. My ancient faith, no doubt thinking about the Declaration and Jefferson's ideas, my ancient faith teaches me that there can be no moral right with one man making a slave of another. What I do say, Lincoln continues here, is that no man is good enough to govern another without that other's consent. This, he concludes, is the leading principle, the sheet anchor of American republicanism. So there is Abraham Lincoln referring to the doctrine of consent, by which he says that no man is good enough to govern another without that other's consent, calling this the leading principle or the sheet anchor of American republicanism. That statement, as I was suggesting a moment ago, is part of his debate with Douglas over the issue of slavery. And it in many ways cut to the core of the meaning of consent. Douglas also, in some respects, tried to derive his views from an idea of consent. What Douglas said was that regarding slavery, he said he didn't care It was a matter of indifference to him whether people of a particular state or a territory wanted slavery or didn't want it. Whatever they wanted, that is to say, whatever the majority consented to, was all right with him. He might prefer it not to be, but again, it was what people consented to, what the majority wanted, that would decide the matter. Lincoln, however, had said that the doctrine of consent is not simply a kind of blank check or a blank check, that the doctrine of consent still implied a set of moral limits or restraints on what a people might consent to. Consent was inconsistent with slavery, he said, because again, no one can rule another without that other person's consent. And in many ways, that crucial debate, so fundamental to American history and politics, grows out of a kind of internal problem within Locke's doctrine of consent. Namely, that problem is, what form of government does it make sense for a majority of people to consent to? Does government, in other words, by consent, mean government by whatever the majority wants? Could be a kind of tyranny of the majority, just whatever they want? Or does government by consent entail, again, certain limits and restraints on what majorities can do? What guarantees does Locke provide, you might ask, that government by consent will be informed consent or rational consent? Can people simply consent to anything, to be ruled by any means? This is obviously not an idle or a purely theoretical question, since popular majorities, we know, in the world today, popular majorities can choose they can choose on the basis of whim, will, or some other kind of arbitrary passion, unless there seems to be some set of moral restraints on what individuals or majorities can consent to. What is to prevent a majority from acting just as despotically or just as arbitrarily as a king or any absolute power? That was the question that Lincoln was raising in his argument against Douglas and his claims about consent. But this question of restraints or limits on what a people can consent to raises leads to another question about the doctrine of consent. How is consent conferred? We are citizens of the oldest democracy in the world. Most of us, I guess, are not, maybe not everybody, but most people in this room are citizens of the oldest democracy in the world. Did anyone ask you for your consent? Or me? I'm considerably older, but you know, I have never, did anyone ask for my consent? The idea of giving consent to a form of government implies something active, an emphatic voice. But has anyone since the first generation of founders who ratified the Constitution ever been asked or required to give their consent to it? You might ask, what is Locke's answer to this problem? It is a problem that he is aware of and struggles with in that important chapter. His answer turns out to be something quite different from our views about citizenship and who is a citizen and how is the consent of the citizen conferred on government. In section 118, he writes, "A child is born a subject of no country or government." In other words, he's saying citizenship is not conferred by birth. Just being born in a place does not make you a citizen of it, as doctrine that we hold. Every person, Locke continues, is born free and equal in many ways in a kind of state of nature under the authority only of their parents. What government that person may choose to obey is not a matter of birth. but of choice. And again, Locke seems to be making some kind of active principle of choice or decision, a principle of citizenship and the conferring of consent. And it is only, he says, that when a child reaches what he calls the age of discretion, 18 or 21 or something like that, that one is obligated to choose through some sign or mark of agreement to accept the authority of government. Locke is not altogether clear about how such a sign or a mark is to be given. One suspects from what he is saying he may be referring to some kind of oath or some kind of pledge or some kind of civil ceremony where one vows or pledges with one's word, the acceptance of the form of the state. Nothing can make any man so, Locke writes, that is to say, an actual citizen of a state. Nothing can make any man so, but his actually entering into it by positive agreement and express promise and compact, he says at 122. By express promise and compact, such an express promise or agreement leaves one, he says, perpetually and indispensably obliged to be and remain unalterably a subject of it, that is, to the state. So once you give your word or agreement, Locke says, you are perpetually and indispensably obligated to that state. That's how seriously Locke takes this idea of consent. It's something that can only be entered into at the age of discretion. It must be given consciously, fully, rationally, presumably in some kind of ceremony. And once given, your consent to the form of government